When people think about medieval warfare, they usually imagine knights as the most powerful force on the battlefield. But in real combat, heavy armor and a war horse were not enough to guarantee victory. Across medieval Europe, armies found practical ways to stop cavalry, break charges, and neutralize elite fighters. In this video, we're going through 10 anti-knight tactics that actually worked. Number 1. Bad ground. When people picture medieval knights, they usually picture a clean charge across open land, because that was the environment where mounted shock action was strongest. The simplest anti-knight tactic was to deny them that environment. At Courtrai in 1302, the Flemish militia stood on ground hemmed in by streams and moats, and the marshy conditions blunted the French horsemen. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce forced the English onto cramped, marshy ground with very little room to maneuver. Agincourt repeated the same pattern on a recently plowed, rain-soaked field bounded by woods, where the narrow front reduced the French numerical advantage and slowed the advance before contact was even made. That matters because a knight's power was never just armor. It was armor plus speed, mass, height, and the impact of a formation that stayed aligned long enough to hit hard. Once the ground turns soft, narrow, broken, or crowded, the horse loses acceleration, the ranks bunch up, and the charge stops being a hammer blow. Now, the knight is still dangerous, but he is fighting under the worst possible conditions, and medieval infantry knew exactly what to do with that. So, one of the most reliable ways to beat knights was not to invent a miracle weapon. It was to make sure the battle happened where cavalry momentum could not fully develop, because once speed disappears, expensive, elite shock troops start looking much more like ordinary men trapped in a bottleneck. Medieval commanders learned to read ground almost the way sailors read weather.
A low patch that held water after rain, a lane between woodland edges, a streamline that looked minor on a map. All of it could decide whether mounted nobles arrived as a compact striking force or as a confused crowd. That is why so many successful anti-knight battles begin with a commander refusing the obvious open field and choosing the awkward place instead. Number 2. Stakes and ditches. Natural terrain was useful, but smart commanders did not rely on nature alone. They built their own anti-cavalry problems. Britannica's survey of medieval tactics is very clear on this point. Some of the first field tactics that truly countered knights used bows or crossbows from behind pits, stakes, or trenches. Robert the Bruce prepared fresh anti-cavalry ditches at the New Park before Bannockburn, not because ditches had to kill large numbers by themselves, but because they disrupted the line of approach and funneled horsemen into places where Scottish infantry could meet them on better terms. The English used the same logic with sharpened stakes. At Agincourt, Henry V's archers planted stakes in front of their position at an angle, and when the French cavalry came on, they could not simply ride over the bowmen and scatter them. That single detail changed the whole geometry of the fight. Instead of archers being exposed light troops, they became part of a defended system. Obstacles also created hesitation, and hesitation was deadly in medieval cavalry combat. A charge had to stay coordinated. If the front rank checked speed, the rank behind compresses. If horses begin veering around obstacles, the formation loses its shape. If the formation loses its shape, the lance charge loses the one thing that made it terrifying. Medieval commanders understood that a pointed stake or a ditch was not impressive on its own. The real value was that it broke rhythm, and once cavalry rhythm broke, the rest of the anti-knight system had a chance to work.
It is easy to underrate this because pits and stakes sound primitive, but that is the point. They were cheap,
quick to prepare and brutally practical. A lord might spend a fortune on horse, armor, and retinue, and then find his battlefield plan ruined by carpentry and digging. In medieval warfare, that kind of low-cost answer to a high-cost threat was a major advantage. Number 3. Pike walls. If bad ground and obstacles slowed a charge, pikes stopped it. This was one of the biggest military changes of the later Middle Ages. The Scots organized dense schiltrons of infantry with long iron-tipped pikes pointed outward, creating a moving hedge of spear points. The Swiss pushed the idea even further. Britannica notes that sound infantry armed with the pike could fend off cavalry with ease, even when outnumbered, as long as the formation kept its cohesion. That last point is everything. A pike formation was not just a bundle of long spears. It was a discipline machine. Every man had to hold his place, keep the point out, and trust the men around him. At Sempach in 1386, the Swiss showed that an army armed primarily with pikes could defeat chivalric elites in the open field, whether mounted or dismounted. Earlier examples in Flanders and Scotland had already shown the basic principle, but the Swiss turned it into a system that the rest of Europe had to take seriously. The knight's lance had reach, but the pike had more reach, more depth, and more men behind it. That meant cavalry no longer automatically owned the first impact. Once infantry could meet the charge with a stable wall of points, the fight stopped being a simple test of who had the better horse and armor. It became a test of nerve, spacing, and unit cohesion. And in that kind of fight, a disciplined infantry block could beat men who had been trained all their lives to dominate on horseback. The psychological effect mattered too. Charging into a hedge of points meant horse and rider had to trust that the line ahead would somehow open. If it did not, the front ranks took the shock first, and the men behind had to keep coming with less room and less confidence. Pike tactics therefore attacked courage as well as bodies. They told cavalry, very plainly, that the old instinct to ride down infantry could now be suicidal. Number 4. Longbow kill zones. The longbow worked against knights, but not in the cartoon version where every arrow punched straight through the heaviest armor on the field. What made longbow tactics effective was the system around the bow. Britannica says both bows and crossbows were capable of defeating armor when properly employed, and that word properly matters. At Crécy in 1346, a smaller English force fighting on foot overwhelmed the finest cavalry in Europe. English and Welsh archers on the wings fired far faster than the French crossbowmen, and repeated French charges were cut apart before they could achieve clean impact. At Agincourt, the setup was just as important as the arrows themselves. The field was muddy, the front was narrow, and the archers stood behind stakes. The French had to cross that ground under fire, then hit a defended line without enough room to deploy smoothly. That is why the longbow became such a feared anti-knight weapon. It did not need to work like magic. It only needed to keep hitting a slow, compressed, exposed target over and over before contact. The longer the advance took, the worse things got for the attackers. By the time they reached the English line, the charge had already been stripped of much of its force. So the real tactic was not use bows. It was create a kill zone where mounted elites have to advance under fast missile fire while their movement is restricted. That formula worked at Crécy, it worked again at Agincourt, and it permanently damaged the old belief that noble cavalry could simply ride through prepared infantry. Just as important, longbow tactics were repeatable. They did not depend on one heroic duel or one lucky charge. They depended on trained archers, disciplined infantry,
and a commander who understood distance and timing. That is why these battles felt so shocking to contemporaries.
The knight was still brave, still heavily armed, still socially dominant. And yet the tactical script kept breaking the same way whenever the defenders were prepared. Number 5. Crossbows from cover. The crossbow was less romantic than the knight and less famous than the longbow. But in practical terms, it was one of the most important anti-knight tools in medieval Europe. Britannica describes it as the first major weapon in the infantry revolution, and notes that it was capable of killing the most powerful mounted warriors while being far cheaper than war horses and armor, and much easier to learn than mounted combat or the longbow. That helps explain why elites feared it so much, that the Lateran Council of 1139 tried to ban its use against Christians. But the crossbow had clear limits. In the open field, it had shorter range, lower accuracy, and a slower rate of fire than a serious military bow, which made crossbowmen vulnerable to cavalry if they were caught without protection. That is exactly why the best anti-knight crossbow tactic was positional warfare. Use crossbowmen on walls, behind parapets, in rough terrain, or in any defended place where cavalry cannot hit them cleanly. Britannica even notes that the weapon could be fired from behind a parapet, and that it excelled in positional and guerrilla warfare. In other words, the crossbow was not mainly about winning a dramatic archery duel in the middle of an open field. It was about making armor and noble status much less valuable whenever the knight had to approach a protected shooter. It also changed the economics of war. A knight represented years of training, breeding, equipment, and social privilege. A crossbowman was much cheaper to raise and much easier to replace. That did not erase cavalry, but it did mean that mounted elites could no longer assume that common infantry with missile weapons were harmless. And because crossbow skill could be taught much faster than longbow mastery, towns and rulers could expand missile power without waiting a generation for a bow culture to develop. That made the crossbow especially useful in places where urban militias, mercenaries, and castle garrisons mattered more than aristocratic cavalry traditions. It was not flashy, but it was scalable. And scalability is one of the reasons it kept showing up wherever armored horsemen were a problem. Number 6. Halberds and polearms. Once a knight's charge had been slowed, stalled, or broken, the next job was finishing the fight at close range, and that is where polearms came in. The halberd is a perfect example. Britannica describes it as a weapon that let a foot soldier contend with an armored man on horseback. Its forward point could keep the rider at distance, its axe blade could deliver a heavy finishing blow, and its rear projection could pierce armor or pull a horseman off balance. In the Infantry Revolution article, Britannica is even more direct. The halberd was a specialized weapon for fighting armored men-at-arms and penetrating knightly armor. That is exactly why these weapons mattered. Swords looked prestigious, but against armored opponents, they were often not the best answer. Reach, leverage, and concentrated force mattered more. Polearms gave infantry all three. The Swiss system made this especially clear. The pikes delivered the initial shock and held the enemy in place, and then the halberdiers moved in to do the deadly work once the mounted attack had lost momentum. That sequence is important. Medieval anti-knight tactics were often layered. First, you slow the cavalry. Then you stop it. Then you exploit the moment when a rider is crowded, unbalanced, or fighting on foot. Polearms were ideal for that last phase because they were built for control as much as damage. They could hook, thrust, strike, and keep space. Against a fully armored opponent,
That versatility mattered a lot more than flashy individual swordsmanship.
This also helps explain why so many anti-knight infantry systems preferred weapons that looked more like tools on sticks than elegant sidearms. Against a rider or a man in plate, the question was not style. It was whether the weapon could control distance, create leverage, and hit hard enough at the right angle. Polearms answered yes, much more often than swords did.
Number 7. Fighting on foot. One of the smartest anti-knight tactics was surprisingly simple. Stop answering cavalry with cavalry. Instead of joining the enemy in a mounted melee, some of the most successful late medieval commanders put their own elite troops on foot and built the battle around a steady infantry center. At Crécy, Edward III placed dismounted men-at-arms in the middle with archers on the wings, and Britannica treats that battle as a major turning point. It says the victory of longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms over mounted French chivalry marked the end of massed cavalry charges by European knights for about a century and a half. That is a huge shift, and it happened because dismounting solved several problems at once. It reduced the temptation for nobles to launch premature charges, made the battle line more stable, and allowed missile troops and obstacles to do their work without being abandoned by impetuous cavalry. It also meant elite fighters could still use their armor, training, and discipline, just in a form better suited to a defensive battle. This was not glamorous by chivalric standards, but it was effective. The English repeated versions of the same approach in later Hundred Years' War battles, including Agincourt, where men-at-arms held the center while archers anchored the flanks. In practical terms, this was a direct admission that the battlefield had changed. The best answer to a knight was no longer always another knight charging head-on. Sometimes the best answer was a prepared infantry position held by heavily armed professionals on foot, supported by missile fire and obstacles, forcing the enemy cavalry to attack a target that would not break. There was also a command and control benefit. Mounted nobles in feudal armies could be hard to restrain once battle started, and a premature charge could tear apart the whole plan. Dismounted deployment made units easier to anchor and easier to keep in line with the rest of the army. In that sense, fighting on foot was not just a combat choice. It was a way of imposing discipline on troops whose social status often encouraged individual action. Number 8. Ambush. In passes. Some commanders did not even bother waiting in a formal battle line. They attacked knights where knights could barely function. The Battle of Morgarten in 1315 is one of the clearest examples. An Austrian Habsburg force of knights tried to move through the Morgarten Pass along Lake Egeria, and the men of Schwyz, with their Confederate allies, struck before the Austrians were out of the pass. Britannica says more than 1,500 were killed, others were driven into the lake, and the rest were put to flight. It also calls Morgarten one of the first victories by dismounted commoners over armored knights in many years. The logic is obvious once you picture the terrain. A cavalry column in a confined route cannot properly deploy, cannot build charging momentum, and cannot easily help the men trapped ahead or behind. The horse is still there, the armor is still there, the social prestige is still there, but the tactical advantages are almost gone. Medieval tactical writing and modern analysis both stress that knights were much more vulnerable when cohesion broke down or when they were separated from supporting infantry and drawn into ambush. Morgarten showed exactly how to exploit that weakness. Instead of meeting a knightly force in a broad field and admiring its pageantry, the Swiss hid it in a place where the column could not turn its strengths into battlefield power. That result mattered far beyond one battle. It helped launch the military reputation of the Swiss
and showed that common infantry did not need to defeat knightly elites by matching them in status or equipment. They only had to choose the kind of ground where elite cavalry could not behave like elite cavalry. It also cut against the whole chivalric idea of how battle was supposed to look.
An ambush in a pass offered almost no room for display, challenge, ransom culture, or orderly mounted combat. It turned war into a problem of movement, surprise, and geometry. For practical soldiers, that was fine. For knightly elites who expected room to operate, it was a disaster.
Number 9. Wagon forts. By the 15th century, the Hussites in Bohemia created one of the most effective anti-knight systems medieval Europe ever saw. Under Jan Žižka, they used mobile armored farm wagons fitted with cannon and combined them with infantry, cavalry, and artillery as a single tactical body. Britannica says Žižka revolutionized warfare this way and became a master at forcing his enemies to attack at a disadvantage. His system proved practically unbeatable for a time. What made this so dangerous for knights was that it turned peasant mobility and improvised defense into a battlefield machine. A wagon fort denied the clean, shock action cavalry needed. It also gave missile troops and early guns protected firing positions, while disciplined infantry waited for the right moment to counterattack. In other words, the wagons were not just barriers. They were anchors for a whole combined arms method. That is why Žižka's victories mattered so much. He was not merely defending against cavalry. He was redesigning the battlefield, so cavalry had to attack into prepared fire, broken approaches, and coordinated resistance. Britannica also notes that he was among the first commanders to handle infantry, cavalry, and artillery together in one tactical system. That is a very modern-sounding idea, and it helps explain why knightly armies had such trouble with the Hussites. Feudal levies often depended on prestige, personal bravery, and the traditional expectation that mounted elites would decide the day. Žižka's method replaced that with discipline, position, and weapon integration. Once that happened, knightly charges stopped looking like the center of war and started looking like one arm among several, and not always the best one. Another reason this worked is that wagon forts bought time. Medieval cavalry counted on quick decisions and shock.
Žižka's system kept delaying that decision, making the attackers absorb fire, lose order, and then face a counterattack when their momentum was already gone. Once time itself starts working against the charge, cavalry stops being the side that imposes the battle and becomes the side reacting to it. Number 10. Early gunpowder. By the late Middle Ages, anti-knight tactics were no longer only about slowing cavalry and surrounding armored men with pikes. Gunpowder was beginning to change the terms of the fight. Early European gunpowder weapons were crude, and the first hand cannon was so awkward that they often required a second person to fire them. But by the middle of the 15th century, technical changes such as the matchlock made handheld firearms far more usable, and small arms became a distinct class of weapon. More important on the battlefield, artillery started to matter in ways knights could not ignore. At Castillon in 1453, French forces under Jean Bureau approached with recently introduced field artillery, fortified their camp strongly, and when the English attacked prematurely, French cannon inflicted heavy losses and helped rout them. That battle is one of the clearest signs that the old battlefield order was fading. Armor still mattered, elite cavalry still mattered, but gunpowder meant that packed formations of armored men could now be punished by weapons whose power did not depend on muscle, momentum, or hand-to-hand reach. Britannica's broader military history also makes the timeline clear. The handgun and the harquebus emerged as important weapons in the 15th century, right at the point when the knights' old monopoly on battlefield shock was already under pressure from pikes, bows, crossbows, and disciplined infantry. So the final anti-knight tactic was not really a single trick. It was a technological shift. Once cannon and firearms entered the picture in a serious way, the battlefield asked a new question.
It was no longer just whether a knight could survive the charge. It was whether armor, horseflesh, and noble training still justified their enormous cost in a world where cheaper troops with gunpowder could break them from behind fieldworks or from inside a fortified camp. And this change hit the social meaning of knighthood as much as the tactical one. For centuries, battlefield importance helped justify noble privilege. But once infantry with pikes, missiles, wagons, and guns could stop or break armored cavalry, military value was no longer concentrated in one mounted class. The knight did not disappear overnight, but the battlefield was clearly moving towards systems that rewarded drill, coordination, and firepower more than individual mounted shock.